Dr. Haley and Dr. McCawley will be discussing the findings of their recent research and paper entitled The Adequacy of Certain Setbacks for Directional High-Volume Hydraulic Fracturing in the Marcellus, Barnett, and Niobrara Shale Plays. Before I turn the meeting over to them, I would ask that you please join us for the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay. We will, at this point, turn the meeting over to Dr. Marcia Haley.
Good evening. Thanks for having me. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay.
Is that one yours, Dr. Haley?
That's Mike's.
There you go. Oh, wrong one. Sorry.
Yep, okay. I don't know if you want to turn down those lights near the projector. Thank you. Okay, so tonight I'm going to talk about public health and safety in proximity to directional high-volume hydraulic fracturing. And as we just heard, this is based on a paper that we recently published. So just as an introduction, why is unconventional hydraulic fracturing different than conventional hydraulic fracturing that we've been seeing for many years in Pennsylvania? Well, one, the well pad site is very large, and as you can see by this picture, it has a very large footprint compared to a conventional well, and includes accessory equipment, earth movers, and often multiple wells on a pad site. There's also a lot of high-volume liquids that are excuse me, utilized in fracking an unconventional well, and this typically uses millions of gallons of water that requires thousands of trucks to truck to and from the site. And this also requires need for high volume disposal. There's some issues once the wells are fracked that the water contains chemicals and radiation, and that there's a risk for well integrity and aquifer contamination. And then the last thing is that because we have high pressure methane that is combustible within a certain percentage of air, there's a fire and explosion risk. So what are some of the public health risks associated with this process? Some of these that we looked at in our paper were explosions and heat exposure, toxic gases including sulfides, air pollution, some others that we did not examine but are also concerns are methane pollution, water contamination, earthquakes, noise pollution, and stress. So our recent publication was published in Environmental Health Perspectives, and as we heard, this is on the adequacy of setbacks in 3 shale plays. For this analysis, we looked at geography and production of each shale play, current statutes and regulations, blowouts and evacuations, thermal modeling and heat exposure, and vapor clouds and air pollution. So for geography and production, we looked at the Barnett Shale in Texas, the Niobrara Shale in Colorado, and the Marcellus Shale in Pennsylvania, which is what we'll focus on for tonight's discussion. Marcellus Shale covers 64% of Pennsylvania. In 2014, there were over 70,000 producing gas wells. And in Westmoreland County, there are currently 494 permits with 271 active wells, and currently 7 well permits in Murrysville itself, with about half of those considered active. Setback distances vary by state, from the very conservative to the very liberal. From left to right, the most liberal is Texas, which is 200 feet. Pennsylvania is 500 feet. Colorado is 500 feet with 1,000 feet to a high occupancy building. Maryland is currently 1,000 feet with 2,000 feet proposed by the University of Maryland Public Health Study, and in New York it's not permitted. With regard to policies and oversight on the federal level, there is a certain level of heat protection from fires, which is measured in a maximum of kilowatt per meter squared. There's a limit on sulfide exposure, which is which is through NIOSH and OSHA for occupational limits. The EPA recommends green completion, and I believe at this point it's mandatory, which means that the excess gas at a well site was in the past flared or burned off or vented into the atmosphere, and this was a significant source of air pollution and methane pollution. And now the EPA recommends that that gas be captured and put back into the system rather than flared or vented. And at the federal level, there's also oversight on volatile organic compounds and sulfur dioxide. At the state level, our state setback distance is 500 feet from the wellhead to buildings. And with the portions of Act 13 challenged in the Robinson Township decision, the 500 feet is now considered a minimum, and the municipality may adjust that distance as they see fit. 1,000 feet from a public water supply, and there's also a different thing, not a setback, but it's called a distance that was recently approved in Chapter 78 and 78A. That's 200 feet from the edge of a disturbance, which is the edge of the well pad, to the common area, which is a playground or a park or other outdoor area. And then the state also regulates traffic, noise, and air quality. At the local level, you have zoning boards, planning commissions, township councils, and noise ordinances. So as far as explosions and evacuations, fortunately, blowouts are rather uncommon. It's 1 in 10,000 wells. In our paper, we looked at 5 years from 2010 to 2015 in the Marcellus Shale. And that from that time period, we saw 8 reported well blowouts. And it's important to realize that this is not all well integrity failures. These are the ones that we could gather data on. These resulted in 1 death, 7 burn unit hospitalizations, 410 families evacuated, a no-fly zone, and closure of a highway. And the most common evacuation zone was 1 mile. Now that wells are being placed closer to where people work and live, there are some special considerations with regard to suburban well fires. And things that we have to look at, obviously, are smoke, power lines, other wells, hydrogen sulfide gas, explosions, and heat. And when evacuations are ordered, they should be quick and efficient with ongoing communication to evacuees. One thing that we were interested in looking at in our paper, what is the risk of burn from a blowout fire? Because these fires can be rather large. And so we looked at the Pennsylvania setback distance of 500 feet, and the calculation for an average well showed that after 30 minutes, second-degree burns would likely to form, which is blistering. At a closer distance, such as in Colorado or Texas, second-degree burns would form after about 20 seconds. And one thing that we looked at was how long does it take to evacuate a school? Because if you're looking at 500 feet from a well site to a high-occupancy building such as a school, how long would it take to evacuate in the event of a fire? And ideally, in a fire drill situation, this is 5 to 10 minutes, but in actual situation, it tends to be longer. The best data we had was on Sandy Hook Elementary, and it took over 30 minutes to evacuate after the shelter-in-place was lifted. So obviously, the concern is for a high-occupancy building that if it takes you 30 minutes to evacuate, then you have some burn risk from that well fire potentially. We also looked at the literature on well site pre-planning, and this was done by Wolverton in Louisiana, and it was a literature review, and unfortunately they found that well site pre-planning was not as optimal as we would like to see. Some of the problems they found were minimal research into emergency response planning, inadequate resources, proximity to high occupancy facilities, size of the fires, and lack of training and equipment. The Marcellus Shale Coalition recommends review the development site and access routes prior to planning a well. They recommend assessing constraints and sensitive resources such as schools, churches, and hospitals. The DEP has now become more active with the oil and gas reporting electronic system for reporting problems and also registration of well sites. And now with Chapter 78, Section 55, they have they're required to come up with a preparedness, prevention, and contingency plan for each site that assesses site-specific conditions, including local emergency contact information. So we're hoping that this will improve this process. Hydrogen sulfide is another air pollutant that we looked at, and it has particular health effects. Some of these are odor, stress and annoyance, respiratory irritation, increased need for anti-asthma drugs, compromised learning, and DNA damage. The DEP has special caution areas where well sites are above the OSHA ceiling limit for hydrogen sulfide, and there's about 20 wells in Pennsylvania that fit this criteria. One of the studies that we examined on our paper looked at the potential impact radius of hydrogen sulfide. If a pipeline were ruptured, what would the toxic gas cloud likely be? And as you can see here, it's over 1,000 feet for urban and rural conditions, so it would be beyond the setback distance. Another study we reviewed was the Fort Worth League of Neighborhoods did air modeling based on air measurements from the Texas Committee on Environmental Quality and industry measurements around well site, and they did dispersion modeling to determine how far sulfides can travel from the well site. And unfortunately, the sulfide plumes extended over 1 mile from the source, and they were much over the short-term health benchmark for sulfides. And this is an overlay next to an elementary school for the sulfides, which is unfortunate because children are very sensitive to this neurotoxin. We also reviewed briefly some of the health studies that I wanted to bring up here, and one was from Dr. McKenzie. And we're seeing a trend in these health studies, and we'll go over a couple of these. This one showed that the number of babies born with congenital heart disease increased with increasing well density. So the more wells the mother lived near, the increased risk of congenital heart disease. In this area, they looked at birth records and determined that infants that lived that were born in the highest well density where their mothers lived had increase in low birth weight below the 10th percentile. And then in northeast Pennsylvania, they looked at hospitalization records and found that, again, hospitalization rates corresponded with increased well density, particularly hospitalizations for heart disease and neurologic disease. And then in Washington County, there was a household survey that showed that the closer you were living to wells, the higher the rate of physical symptoms such as upper respiratory symptoms, skin, and overall symptoms. So our paper had some limitations. We only did well sites in 3 shale plays. We did not look at compressor stations or pipelines, which is a large area. We used media reports for some of the blowout data. We tried to verify that with official reports when possible, but media reports can introduce bias. The air pollution data, we only focused on the sulfides and benzene. We did not look at nitrogen oxide, particulate matter, VOCs, and ozone, which are significant pollutants from wells. And we also used an average gas well model, which does not take into account local geography, weather patterns, and engineering specifics. So the conclusions in our paper were that the Pennsylvania 500-foot setback distance is not sufficient in all cases to protect public health and safety. Individuals that are within this distance, in some cases, are vulnerable to thermal injury, sulfide exposure, and air pollution. We're seeing a trend in adverse health outcomes associated with well density and proximity. And for this paper, we recommended industry best practices in conjunction with reasonable setback distances, as well as comprehensive site pre-planning and mitigation technology. So for each municipality, it's somewhat difficult in Pennsylvania because the council or board is weighing economic benefit versus health and safety risks. One of the things we looked at in our paper was risk assessment, and the EPA particularly looks at cancer risk assessment, and they have definite levels, but within those limits, they say that each community has to decide the risk and benefit on this particular scale as to what works for them. So it's still being worked out, as you know, in a lot of municipalities in Pennsylvania. Would you like me to wait until Dr. McCawley finishes before we take the questions?
Probably, yeah.
Okay.
I think that would work well.
I'll get that for you. Alan's a little computer challenged.
There are times when we all are, Jim.
Tell everybody.
Okay, so I don't probably get to tell my
I probably shouldn't tell my joke tonight that I
Oh,
always
jokes
tell.
are always good.
Because if you watch the YouTube for what I did in Peters, I told this joke. But however, here it goes anyway. There were these two guys that were up in a balloon, and they got into a cloud bank, couldn't see with the ground, didn't know where they were, and they finally got out of the cloud bank and still didn't know where they were. So they saw someone down on the ground, and they yelled down to him, and they said, "Hello down there, can you tell us where we are?" And the guy down on the ground said, "Well, sure, you're up in the air." And the other guy in the balloon says to the one who yelled down, he says, "Well, who was that? What did he say?" He says, "Oh, that was a scientist." He said, "How'd you know that?" He says, "Because what he told me was absolutely true, but completely useless." And so I hope, being a scientist, that what I'm going to tell you is completely true, but hopefully not useless. I want to talk a little bit about some of the issues that are involved here. And I'm going to talk mostly about the air emissions that we've looked at. Now, I did a study for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection looking at 7 different well sites and looking at the setback distance and whether it seemed to be adequate for protection of the population for particularly air emissions and noise. And what we found was that at the 625 feet from the wellhead setback distance, we were not seeing levels that were above the national ambient air quality standards. Now, what that means is there's the regulations for the EPA and for the state say here's a concentration of actually 6 kinds of pollutants that occur commonly in the air. And here's the level at which we think it's safe. And so the ambient air quality standards say you should be below those levels. So at that 625-foot distance, we were below those levels. Now, we did not sample these places year-round. We sampled them for a few days. So it was a snapshot in time of what was going on. And that's important to know because there are lots of things that can happen over time that don't just happen every single day. And so some of the kinds of things I'm going to talk about tonight and say, well, if you have these particular conditions, it can make things worse. And it may be that you won't meet the ambient air quality standards if some of these things are occurring. But I want you to know that in the report, which is available at the West Virginia University School of Public Health website under my department, Occupational and Environmental Health, you can go there, download the full, I think it's 245-page report. So it's a lot of reading, there's a lot of charts, a lot of tables, and essentially it says, for the most part, for what's controlled normally, those 6 pollutants that are normally looked at by the EPA, by the Department of Environmental Protection, you weren't over those levels. However, there were some things where we were, and let's talk about those. So first of all, let's address, is there adequate monitoring? I don't know if you saw it, but today the head of the Pennsylvania DEP announced that they had just bought 10 new monitors for monitoring sites. Now, this is a little hard to see, I guess, but here are all of the dust monitoring sites for what they call fine dust, that is, particulate matter that's less than 2.5 micrometers in size. And how big is a micrometer? Well, a human hair is about 100 micrometers in diameter. So you can fit 42.5 micrometer particles stacked end to end up a human on across the diameter of a human hair. That's how tiny they are. And so these are the sites, and the PM 2.5 is supposed to represent what will get down into your lungs. It's not a very, toxicologically speaking, not a very good measure of dose to your lungs, but it measures something that's sort of related. The technology is kind of a little old that they're using for this, but it takes a while to change a regulation. I worked for the government for 30 years, and in that time, I worked on 2 different regulations. One of them took 20 years to get done. The other took 30 years to get done. And they were on things that we knew about, that you've probably heard about. One of them was on silica. If you've heard of silicosis, that's what silica causes. And the other was on diesel exposure and looking at whether diesel was, in fact, something that caused cancer. And, in fact, in both of those cases, we started out knowing that silica caused silicosis, and we were pretty sure from all of the animal testing that diesel caused cancer. But it took still 20 and 30 years to get those things passed. It's a slow process because we have to go through due process. The law is messy, but it's the only thing that we've got that stands between us and tyranny, really. And so sometimes there are things that just aren't as efficient as they could be. But an efficient democracy, I believe Winston Churchill said, is a tyranny. So, you know, the next time we're completely inefficient, remind people of that and say, you know, we're being anti-tyrannical. So are these standards adequate? Well, here's the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. It's a little hard to see. The things that are down there are carbon monoxide, lead, and lead is an old pollutant. I gave this question to my class recently about lead in the air, and they said, there's no lead in the air. That's because they weren't around when there was lead in gasoline. And so since they've taken the lead out of gasoline, lead exposures have gone down dramatically. But lead is still on the ambient air quality standard list. The oxides of nitrogen, right? The air is composed of nitrogen and oxygen. And when you combust things, those two chemicals, those two gases, combine together and form nitrogen oxides, NO and NO2. The ozone, if you're familiar with smog in Los Angeles or smog anywhere, a lot of that is ozone that's formed. And then there's particulate matter and sulfur dioxide, SO2. That's the stuff that people complain about coming out of power plant stacks, right? And we monitored at some of these sites not only for those 6 pollutants. Actually, we didn't monitor for lead because you're just not going to find it anymore. But for the other 5, we monitored for them, and we monitored for some other things. And this is one of the things that we monitored for because we had heard that there was something called BTEX at these sites. BTEX is an acronym. It stands for benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylene. These are all sort of in the same family of chemicals. They're benzene-type compounds. And benzene we know to be a carcinogen. However, this chart, which suggests what exposure should be to keep people safe, is really not based on cancer. Because when you come right down to it, if something is a carcinogen, there is no safe dose. Theoretically, at least, one molecule of carcinogen can cause cancer. Now, in practice, we would have a terrible time trying to see anything like that. But this is actually based on benzene causing some changes to your immune system, the system that protects your body from disease, from infection, and those kinds of things. And so for this, they had an exposure limit that they said was safe if you were going to be exposed to it all the time of 3 parts per billion. That is 3 molecules of benzene in every billion molecules of air, which is pretty low. And that's the exposure limit for this. That's what CDC and one of its agencies called ATSDR, which stands for this alphabet soup of things, but that's what they have proposed. So we looked at all of these sites for what level of benzene was there. And the numbers here are the multiples of 3 that we found. So in one particular site, we were at 28 times the level that was proposed as being relatively safe, that you wouldn't have to worry about these immune system effects from. So 28 times that level, that's something to be concerned about. In fact, it's a level that's high enough that you would be concerned about the workers who are there, who might only be exposed to it for 8 hours a day. And this concentration was found on average for a full 72-hour period, which was the sampling period that we took. So it was pretty high. The reason it was high in this case, by the way, is that they were flaring right where our equipment was. We were 625 feet from the wellhead, and they had decided to set up a flare 625 feet from the wellhead, literally next to our equipment, which they thought was hilarious because they knew it was going to throw off our levels, which it did. We got 28-fold times what it should have been. Now, I don't think that was exactly what they were thinking when they put it there, They were thinking it was going to somehow throw it off in some other direction, but it didn't. And those are the kinds of levels. Flaring is one of those things where you get the gas, it's going up, you light a match to it, so to speak, and you set it on fire. It's not a very efficient combustion process. So a lot of this stuff that should be combusted doesn't get combusted in a flare. And enough of it comes out that you can see these kinds of high levels. So flaring is not a particularly good thing. But this is not one of those compounds that's on the National Ambient Air Quality Standard list. Okay? So we were well above that level that the CDC recommends you be below. Now, along with that, we also saw benzene in a lot of places where they actually weren't flaring, and in fact, in a couple of places where they actually weren't even drilling. And so you might think, well, is it just in the background there? Well, it could be, but in fact, there's another source of benzene, and here it is. Right here. These are diesel trucks. Remember I said I got some things passed on diesels? Well, we know diesels produce benzene, and they produce these little tiny particles that are much, much smaller in order, or to 2 orders of magnitude smaller than the fine particles that are called ultrafine particles. And these ultrafine particles we're very worried about as scientists right now, because a lot of the experiments that we're doing with these particles, these are nanoparticles. And if you've ever heard of nanotechnology and nanos everything, the reason why you don't necessarily hear a lot about nanotechnology is because of nanotoxicology. When we started looking at these nano-sized particles, they're called nano because they're nanometers in size. A nanometer is 1/1000th of a micrometer. So you can stack several thousand of these little tiny particles across a human hair and get away with it, so to speak. These little tiny particles are things that we're real concerned about because they seem to be really, really toxic. Whenever we do the exposures with these kinds of things, the amount that will cause a toxic response is an amount that's almost not weighable. In fact, we have a different way of metering these particles. We have to count the number, not weigh the amount that's there, because they are so tiny, and even such a small number of these can cause so much damage, it appears, that we have to say how many particles are there per cubic centimeter of air. And so that's what you see coming out of diesels. And at West Virginia University, we're kind of proud of the fact that we do a lot of diesel research. In fact, my friend Dan Carter just appeared in Time magazine last week as one of the 100 most influential people in the world because he was the one who turned in Volkswagen. And actually, he was using some of my equipment, so I sort of... I think I get a free autograph for that. So. And ultrafine particles are currently not regulated by the EPA or the DEP. And that's because the scientific community is still studying them. And it's going to take probably 20 years before you see regulations on ultrafine particles. That doesn't mean they're not going to be that can't cause harm in the meantime. And so we're concerned that people know about this and keep track of what's going on with these kinds of things. And these are the kinds of levels that we see when we sit on a street corner with trucks going by. And this is from downtown Morgantown, okay? And we were counting about 20 to 30 heavy-duty diesel trucks per hour going by our sampling station. Now, I was in Montrose, Pennsylvania, which is northeastern Pennsylvania, up in Gasland. You've heard the documentary Gasland. Well, whether you believe or not what they say about Gasland, in Montrose, Pennsylvania, if you stand on the corner, you will have a heavy-duty diesel truck pass by you about every 45 seconds. And that's because these are the things that are hauling stuff to and from the drilling sites. When you have a drilling site, your really doing manufacturing of sorts. You're bringing in a product and making something with it. In this particular case, it's sand and water with some chemicals and biocides mixed in. And you're putting it down that hole. So to bring in all of that sand and all of that water, it takes a lot of truck trips. How many truck trips? If there are 6 holes on the pad, the state of Maryland estimated in their risk assessment document that it takes about 10,000 truck trips for those 6 holes. It's around 1,900 to 2,000 maybe if you have only 1 hole. Now that is a lot of trucks. That is almost getting up to the level of interstate travel on these small roads. Now, I have had people say, okay, so all you're talking about is, an interstate going in. Well, that's not very harmful, is it, right? Well, unfortunately, in all of the studies people have done looking at the health of people who live next to interstates, people who live next to interstates are very unhealthy. They tend to have higher rates of cancer, higher rates of lung disease, higher rates of cardiovascular problems, all of those kinds of things. We looked at what was going on in southern West Virginia where there was mountaintop removal. And in those counties where there was mountaintop removal, there were epidemic levels of cancers. And the distinguishing feature in the mountaintop removal areas were these ultrafine particles. Those were the things that distinguished it from the areas in which the disease rates were much lower. And so we're concerned that that might be a problem here because you've got diesel traffic that's going to and from these sites. And if you have, as I've heard said, planned that there might be 24 holes to a pad, then you're talking about 40,000 truck trips. And that's one well pad. So if you have multiple well pads, as you will in a lot of these areas, you have multiple trucks going through, and they tend to funnel down to the major arteries. So Route 22 out here, is where they'll be funneling to, but they may be funneling to the better roads leading to that because you're not going to put one of these large trucks on a one-lane road and have it go fast. Because the people who are running these things are making their money by the number of loads they carry. And so they want to get where they're going as quickly as they can get there. So they don't want to go down tiny roads. They want to go down slightly bigger roads. And when we've studied interstates, people say it's kind of dangerous to within about 300 meters of the interstate. So if you can get back, if you can get a setback a little more than 300 meters away, then, okay, you're probably in a much lower risk zone. But that 300-meter zone is not a lower risk zone. And that's pretty well established. That's not one of those things that people seem to argue about very much, because that kind of work has been going on for quite a while. Now, we're getting cleaner diesels. And in the next 20 or 30 years, a lot of these dirtier diesels that produce these kinds of levels, by the way, that green line is where we think you could see health effects, according to all of the literature that we've seen and some of the studies that we've done. And the levels that we see, the peak levels are 10 to 20 times that green line. And that's just standing on a corner with regular kind of truck traffic going by. So that's a concern for truck traffic. And this is just the human hair and how small stuff is. So are setbacks protective? Well, the answer is sort of, kind of, not all the time. I wish I could be a little more specific than that, but I mean, that's the case. It's sort of, kind of, but not all the time. Because it depends upon what happens and when it happens. So this is a picture taken from 625 feet from the wellhead. Okay, this is at the setback distance. Notice how far you are from the trucks. Not very. So there was issues here of both noise and air pollution. The dust from what's going on. This is pad site preparation that's going on. So they're clearing the area, cutting down trees, putting in essentially a road and a pad and all of that. So they're earth moving. So you get lots of dust and dirt, and you get the diesels. But the other thing that we have to worry about is terrain and meteorology. So first of all, with terrain, it matters whether you're down in a holler or up on top of a hill. Now, where these setbacks originated from, really, was out in the Midwest, in Oklahoma and Texas, which tend not to be real hilly. You know, actually, you get up on the interstate, and you may be at the highest point in the state. You know, so there, it's flat, and the wind blows all the time. If you've ever been to Texas and Oklahoma, you know you've got a constant wind blowing in your face. And if you've got that constant wind and it's flat, yes, having a setback distance works pretty well, because the farther you get away, the lower the concentration is. It dilutes out. It drops exponentially, which means it drops really, really fast with distance. So you don't have to get very far for it to dilute if it's out in the open and the wind is blowing. Now, put it down in a holler. I'm from West Virginia, remember? That's what we call valleys. Put it down in a holler, and there's something else that happens. How many of you have ever seen fog in a holler? Right? Fog forms down in a holler because there's a thing called a thermal inversion that happens in valleys. The sun begins to set. The air above the valley is warmer than the air down in the valley, and a warm air layer over top of a cold air layer will hold what's in the cold air layer down there. And that's an inversion, because usually as you go up in altitude, the air should get colder. And with an inversion, as you go up in altitude, the air gets warmer. So that warm air acts like a lid. How many people here have ever heard of someplace called Donora, Pennsylvania? Well, in 1948, they had an episode in Donora where they had one of these inversions that lasted about 2 weeks. And so what was normally a clear, clean sky town, because they had a zinc smelter and some coke ovens, everything got trapped down in the valley in Donora. And people had to drive around with their lights on during the day because it got so dark from the pollution. And the reason was the inversions were holding the air down there. So those things don't happen. In fact, the kind of thing that you see that happened in Donora in 1948 doesn't happen there very frequently. But you can get inversions that will last, say, an evening or 2 or 3 at a time. And most likely in the fall and sometimes in the spring, you'll see these sorts of things. When there's fog down in the holler, that's what's happening. And because of that, and the meteorology that goes on, and here's little tiny Donora, and there's the fog in the holler. When you see that, the kinds of things that happen are things that happen in Los Angeles. Because what makes Los Angeles so smoggy is the fact that there's a set of mountains on one side of it and the ocean on the other. And the ocean breeze pushes the air up against the mountains, but not over the mountains. And so everything that's generated in Los Angeles, where I think there's a law that if you live in East Los Angeles, you have to work in West Los Angeles. And if you live in West Los Angeles, you have to work in East Los Angeles, so that first thing in the morning, everybody gets in their cars and sits in a traffic jam for an hour. And you get these smoggy kinds of conditions because they're generating things from combustion exhaust. And that's what we're worried about with the diesel traffic. So are there alternatives? Well, I have suggested and have been going around suggesting real-time monitoring of these situations. Not for the standard kinds of things that you think about for monitoring. You know, when we talk about the ambient air quality standards and the DEP says we're going to put new monitors up, what they're doing is they're checking on a particular level compared to a standard. That's not what I'm talking about here. What I'm talking about here is actually doing quality control. So I'm an engineer by training, and I taught engineering students for 30 years. And a lot of my engineering students are now running these gas operations. And hopefully they learned from me, because I told them quality control is essential to any engineering process. How do you do quality control with a gas process like this? Well, first of all, you want to look to see if you're losing any product. So all of these hydrocarbons that people are worried about, that's product. And you don't want to be losing it. So if you're operating correctly, you're not going to be losing that product. You're not going to be polluting. And my engineering students will tell me, you tell us that you found something, and we'll show you how we can fix it. And I believe them. But you have to know that it's leaking. How do you find out if it's leaking? Well, those few dots on the map there aren't enough to tell you it's leaking in your particular location. You got to be in close and personal with that to know what's going on. And so you can put these real-time monitors in someplace like this, and all of the monitors we need fit in something the size of a toolbox, and you can see there are diesel trucks there, and they're monitoring what's going on. It's going up to a well pad site up here. And this is something you want to try to avoid because that truck is sitting there idling. And if it's idling, first of all, the guy's losing money. You know, better logistics say, don't idle. You want to be going back and forth to that well site. You don't want to be sitting there idling. So if you can space them out better, you won't have them idling. If they're idling, they're putting stuff into the air out of the exhaust. And you want to know when that's happening. So you have monitors like this that all fit in one of those toolboxes. And my buddy Dave is here. He's the one who sold me this and lives around here, so he can tell you about this kind of equipment. But this is what will go in. And we can run it off of a couple of solar panels and a couple of marine batteries, so we can set them up anywhere. You can put a transceiver attached to these things that will broadcast out to a computer and tell you, you know, the computer can be attached to the internet. Anybody can see it if they want, or if the people running these monitoring systems want them to see it. And it's a good way to say to the community, we're running a quality operation here. Because maybe not everybody's going to run a quality operation. So one of the things, if you're concerned about drilling, you're going to be concerned about whether the people who are doing the drilling have got their quality control in place. And this is one way of telling that. And the good ones should be really happy to say, let us show you exactly how we're doing this in real time. We'll put it up, we'll show you. My engineers, I know, were encouraging about that. And they said, yeah, we'd like to show people just how well we're doing things and how we're not leaking, how we're not causing it. But doing an operation like this is kind of like building a house. There's a main contractor and there are subcontractors, okay? And I've built my own houses for a couple of times, and I know occasionally I'll get a plumber who's not quite up to snuff, or a carpenter who's, you know, kind of cross-eyed when they go to nail things up, and that's not good. So you don't want subcontractors in these operations that are mucking things around. And having this kind of quality control in place is one way of letting you know whether you've got a real stable output, which is what you should be seeing if there's quality control. You know, if you're on a process line where they're producing widgets, you know, the widgets should all be the same size, the same color, the same shape, constantly, one after another after another. And if they're not, then they're losing process control. They're losing the quality control. And they're probably going to be losing money, if not their shirts. And so I don't think it's really asking anybody to do something that's all that difficult, that's all that out of the question, because this is good engineering practice, knowing if you've got a quality operation going. And this amount of equipment is not that expensive because this amount of equipment can go from well site to well site to well site. It's not use it once and throw it away, right, Dave? It lasts for a while. You know, he told me, oh, yeah, this will last you your lifetime. No, but I'll sell you one next year. And this is what quality assurance might look like. So you've got a stable level going on along here, and then there's a spike. Well, you don't want to see that spike. That means something happened, probably something that happened that maybe shouldn't have. And can you learn from this? Yeah, you can learn from this. And is it going to be different from time to time? Yeah, what goes wrong can be different from time to time. It seems like it's never the same thing in an engineering process. I know. And so you want to see when that's happening or when you're trending upward. So here, you're beginning to trend upward a little bit. So you know you want to do something, and in fact, they did. And now it trended downward and stayed pretty stable. So that green circle means, yeah, this is what it should be looking like. Now you've got quality control and quality assurance, and you know you've got everything under control here in this process. So you're doing the best job you can. Now, whether that's going to be good enough or not is a separate question. Because you're going to have to look to scientists like me to say, what kinds of levels should we be exposed to? Because we're still working on some of that. You know, I'd be lying to you to say, I know what happens with all of these mixtures. I mean, when we do our experiments, we'll take one compound and expose it to one type of animal for one period of time, maybe at a couple of concentrations. But here we're talking about probably hundreds, if not thousands, of compounds that are coming out and that you're being exposed to, potentially. What are they going to do? The answer is, quite honestly, we're not sure. We don't know. It may be nothing. It may be something terrible. And it's very complex and very complicated to say. So we want to know that whatever is going on is the best that can be done. And in fact, you're supposed to be, in the drilling operation, following the best available control technology. Well, the best available control technology means you got to know what's going on to have the best available control technology. If you don't know what's going on, you're not doing your best. Okay? And monitoring after the fact and telling you, ooh, oops, you were overexposed, that's not quality assurance. That's closing the barn door after the horse got out. And that's not what we want to see. Okay? Now we can take questions.
Okay, thank you. Jim will collect... I see-
Cards?
Yeah, Jim will collect any cards or pass out any cards to those who need them. Marcia and Mike, thank you very much. Hopefully, we don't get you too swamped with the questions. And I did like the comment about hollers. Made everybody chuckle, as did the joke.
I can't get my students to laugh at that one.
That's because you're the professor.
Yeah.
Oops. Thank you. Do you want to read them? Sure. Okay, good. Yeah.
Two questions from Cindy Gaswelli, 3051 Wayform Court, Murrysville. Are you willing to publicly acknowledge any limitations to your assessment beyond those that you list at the end of your paper?
Either one of you may answer that, or both of you. The microphone, yeah, the microphone can just come down. Pull that off.
Okay. So as far as limitations, they're the ones that we acknowledged, and another is that the research on hydraulic fracturing is still pretty new. We're just seeing the heavy-duty hydraulic fracturing from unconventional formations in Pennsylvania over the past 10 years or so. So as far as long-term data, we don't have long-term data. Particularly me as an oncologist, we're concerned with some carcinogens associated with the process, like Dr. McCawley said, benzene. We're still not at the point where we would see latent cancers from exposures, but it's one thing that we're looking at. So one limitation is that the science is pretty new, and it's really a burgeoning field, so we're still gathering that data. And the other is that it's difficult to show causation versus association. So, we see a correlation between well density and well proximity with the adverse health outcomes, but it's difficult to point a finger and say this is exactly what caused it. So we're seeing the preponderance of evidence that there's a correlation, but the direct causation is not, or we're not at that point in the science yet. Do you have anything else?
Yeah, I will add, too, that a lot of the studies that have been done don't allow us to draw information about a personal dose. So if you have a monitor that's sitting out in the middle of your community, when we get a number back, we then say, well, that's what all of you were exposed to. Okay? And that's kind of an oversimplification, because to know much more precisely what you were exposed to we'd have to have a monitor on you. We'd have to follow you throughout the day because you don't spend your day right in one location, never moving. And you're not in a cage like our rats. Thought of trying to put you, but no. And so coming up with an exact dose for people is really difficult and something that we are always trying to better at. And when we put papers together like this, the scientists that read this understand that intrinsically. But if it's the public trying to read this paper and take away a message from it, you may not understand what all of the limitations are in doing science. Science is, they say if you want to enjoy your meal, stay out of the kitchen. Well, if you want to enjoy your science, stay out of the laboratory, because it's a mess. And we're always trying to get a better refinement to the numbers that we've got, to assign them to particular people, to look at particular diseases. When did that disease happen? What other things were you exposed to, right? We don't know. We can just say, here's what our monitor said, and here's what we see in this kind of community. These are correlations, not causalities. The thing that I like to show my class is I can show you that there's a correlation between the number of ice cream cones eaten and the number of butterflies in the air, right? So therefore, eating ice cream cones causes butterflies, you would think. Except it doesn't, of course. It's a correlation. They're co-related to something, which is temperature. As temperature goes up, people eat more ice cream cones and butterflies hatch.
The council may ask us follow-up questions, if you have any.
No, he answered it.
Okay.
Must have been the butterflies.
Norman Frankie,
It was about latency periods with benzene because it's a Class A carcinogen. So, yeah.
Norman Frankie, 4816 Sardis Road, Murrysville. Isn't it true that the Baker modeling report that you cited regarding hydrogen sulfide gas clouds from well pads is actually a modeling analysis for the rupture of a natural gas pipeline? Wouldn't you agree that well pads and natural gas pipelines are different with respect to the types and scopes of potential accidents? Given that fact, isn't the use of a pipeline as a surrogate for a well pad inappropriate for comparison on setbacks from well pads? Quite a well-thought-out question for a half hour.
Yeah, exactly. So there were not any studies on potential impact radii for wells, and that was one of the things we wanted to look at in our paper was the potential impact radius. And so, I did use the Baker study, which looked at pipelines. So again, it's a surrogate. And as far as, and that was on the hydrogen sulfide modeling. And so we also looked at as I said, the Fort Worth League of Neighborhoods study, which was, again, more of a dispersion modeling, but, it does show that sulfides can travel a good distance. So again, the science is new and it's still evolving, and, it is what it is, and hopefully in the future we'll have more accurate models, but, this is the most accurate thing that we could come up with sulfide modeling for our paper. Anything else on the sulfides? Yeah.
Darlene Leslie, 3025 Pleasant Valley, with particular matter at 2.5, risk of chronic and systemic illness, which has been found around and at a well pad. Maybe you want to clarify that a little bit, Ms. Leslie?
Particular matters by the size, so say we're at 10, but it doesn't affect you as much as the smaller that it gets. Because then when you inhale it, then it has a chance to go through the lungs into the same as your air, into the rest of your body.
That's a really good question. Let me see if I can give you something that's not a terribly complex answer, because you're asking basic aerosol inhalation toxicology. So here's the deal. Actually, well, let me tell you my bias, first of all. My bias is that actually, from what I'm seeing so far, what I'm reading in the literature and the experiments that I've done, I think the PM 2.5 and the PM 10 are both red herrings. I think they're not the thing that's doing the damage. I think it's that little tiny stuff that's doing the damage. The really small stuff that's doing the damage. Because the really small stuff is smaller than what they call the membrane of a cell. Okay, so your cell is this package of materials, right? And it's got little tiny pores in it, just like your skin has pores in it, right? And the pores are so small that the 2.5 micrometer and 10 micrometer particles won't get through. But you take a 1/10 of a micrometer particle or a 100th of a micrometer particle, which is what the ultrafines are, and it'll pass right into that membrane, through that membrane, and right into the cell. And what we see is something called inflammation. Right? That redness that you get if you scratch your skin, that's inflammation. And inflammation is the start of a lot, if not all, disease processes. And so we're really concerned about the toxicity and the mechanism of toxicity of these ultrafines. The larger particles, however, we know that some larger particles can cause problems, okay? I started off doing coal mining work and black lung. And black lung is caused by particles that are 3 or 4 micrometers in size. So we know 3 or 4 micrometer particles can do some damage, and some of the 10. The 10 micrometer particles, however, tend not to get as far as the lower portions of the lung, where you're really worried about stuff being retained for a long period of time, because the farther you go down in the lung, the harder it is for the lung to get that stuff back out. Normally, if you get particles that deposit in your bronchi are like the branches of a tree. So your lung's like a tree built upside down, branches leading to the leaves. The alveoli are like the leaves, right? So the particles come in and they deposit at on these branches. And your lungs then produce mucus, that's stuff that you hack up, and that will take these particles and move them up the mucociliary escalator. This is little tiny hairs that beat constantly in your lungs, in the epithelial cells, the skin cells in your lung, moving that mucus up and out that's being produced, and moving the stuff that's trapped in that mucus along with it. And within 24 hours, the stuff that's in some of these upper branches are out of your lungs entirely. You've probably ingested them at some point or spit them out. But the tinier stuff will get down and will tend to stick around for months or years. And that's why we worry about the smaller particles, the fine particulate. And that's why the EPA is looking at fine particles, 2.5 micrometers and smaller, and why I kick them in the shins every chance I get to tell them you should be looking at even tinier particles.
Christy Troutman, 4043 Sloanwood Drive. Dr. Haley, what is hydrogen sulfide and how does fracking produce it?
So hydrogen sulfide is found naturally in shale formations. And so it's released when the rock is fractured and the gas, comes into the fracking process and goes up through the well. So hydrogen sulfide is a natural part of that process, and it's considered one of the sulfide gases, which are neurotoxic.
The second question was, at a previous show that we had, there was Huntley and Huntley had stated that there would be 3 well pads in Murrysville with approximately 24 to 30 wells. With the truck traffic from these sites, how much real-time monitoring would reassure the community of safe air?
Well, just monitoring doesn't assure you necessarily of anything. If you're below the ambient air quality standards for NOx and particulate, you can be assured that the chances of seeing some disease from the kinds of things that you're monitoring for are probably pretty low. But there are lots of other things that aren't being monitored for, and they're combinations of things. And so we really don't know about those. So I'd be lying to you to say, oh yeah, just rely upon these ambient air monitors because they're going to keep you safe. Well, we're hoping they're going to keep you safe. And you'd want to know what people are exposed to and where they're exposed to it. And it was like I said before when I was talking about, to know what each person's exposure is, I'd have to have a monitor on them. because everybody has a different thing that they do during the day. If you leave Murrysville and go into Pittsburgh for the day, then you're not being exposed to anything in Murrysville. And it doesn't matter what the monitor says, you weren't exposed to it. On the other hand, if you're sitting at home and you're breathing the air in Murrysville all the day and the monitor is really high, then you have something to be worried about. But the question is, was it high where you were? If we don't have monitors everywhere, we don't know. But a few strategically placed monitors will give you kind of an indication of what's going on. And it's better to know something than to know nothing.
Can I ask a question on
Yeah.
limitations of real-time monitors? Just looking at the slide you had up, looked like it was a PID. Wasn't it? Real-time hydrocarbon monitors, what do you guys recommend? PIDs, FIDs? Any,
okay.
Only because there's limitations with every single one of them.
There's a limitation on every single one. And doing VOC monitoring is mostly art more than science. Well, I can start. I'll run down the list a little bit very quickly. Okay, the PIDs are sensitive only down to the part per million level, and we're talking about part per billion exposures that are
Can't do real-time monitoring.
Yeah, you can't do it with a PID.
Those are SUMICANs.
You could do right, and a SUMICANs is not real time. Now you can get portable GCs that'll go down into this area, and portable GCs, my graduate students will tell you, are no fun to work with.
Yeah, that's why nobody uses them.
Yeah, that's why nobody uses them. But they will give you the information. So, and there's FIDs, much more sensitive, again, but they're also more sensitive to upset, and you've got to watch the calibrations on them, and you've got to do all of these kinds of things. And so when we're talking about volatile organic compounds, it's a difficult situation. There is no single magic bullet that will give you everything you need all in one canister for a very low price, and nobody watching over it constantly.
We can talk about later. I don't want to, everybody's going to glaze over here.
Yeah, sure.
We'll talk about bulb ionization too.
Yeah.
You guys use 10.2, 11.7s. We'll talk about that
Yeah.
later. Okay.
So does this real-time monitoring require professional oversight
It does.
constantly?
Absolutely.
Yes, pretty
Stuff
much.
breaks all the time, Jim.
Yeah.
It constantly goes down.
Yeah. Yeah, the expensive part of the monitoring is not the monitor.
Those are
It-
cheap. It's the
Professional.
people.
Yeah.
The people.
Okay, Randy Steele, 6151 Kemmer Hollow Road. Holler. Excuse me.
Thank you.
It is clear that this paper relied on a number of other reports that were not peer-reviewed, including reports authored by groups opposed to hydraulic fracking, such as the Fort Worth League of Neighborhoods, paper that was done to influence public debate over drilling, not to provide scientific analysis. The same is true for the Ring of Safety report, which relies on unreliable sources of information, such as news articles and Wikipedia, and the report by the Concerned Health Professionals of New York, which is a group opposed to hydraulic fracking. As scientists, do you not have reservations regarding your reliance on these types of unreliable sources?
So for the Fort Worth League of Neighborhoods study, it is true it was not peer-reviewed. However, if you actually read the report, they had a pretty rigorous scientific way that they did it. And the journal that we published in made us go through every step of this report. And so they did use verified air monitoring data, and they did use academic scientists to do this dispersion modeling, and I actually spoke to them myself, and their methods were solid in looking at the dispersion modeling. So even though that was not peer-reviewed, I felt comfortable putting that in the paper, and as well did the journal. As far as Bob Arrington's report, again, that was not peer-reviewed, but I did sit down with Bob and go over all the calculations with him myself, and he is an engineer that's worked in the oil and gas industry for many years, and I felt that we could rely on those calculations to calculate the potential impact from a well, which was something that had not been done in the literature before with explosion risk. And then the third was, what was the third one?
The Concerned Health Professionals of New York.
Oh, the Concerned Health Professionals of New York. So that was a large, actually a pretty large group of scientists that looked at the available peer-reviewed data. And this is actually why the process is banned in New York, because of this group. And they had, if you've ever read the report, they really do a pretty good job of rigorously looking at the available data. Now, you know, a lot of the studies they looked at, you know, some of them were criticized and some of them were I don't think all of them were peer-reviewed, but the majority were. And again, they had a pretty good quality control system in looking at this whole process, and it wasn't just one or two people. It was a rather large group of scientists looking at this, and you know, it was enough to convince the state of New York to ban this process completely due to health concerns and environmental concerns.
Ms. Kenny, I'm not sure that this question is fair to these particular people, because I'm not sure that they would understand our ordinance in comparison to what may be out there. But I'll read the question, and I'll try to address some of it. Excuse me. What state or municipality anywhere has the strictest regulations for fracking, and how do the rules differ from the proposed ordinance, which I assume is our ordinance? Is that correct? Yes. Okay. Did you have an opportunity to read through our ordinances? Okay. I would suggest that you go to an organization on the web that's called Stronger, and they did an evaluation of various regulations from communities across the different plays, and in particular, DEP and Scott Perry, who was one of the speakers that we had here, is active in that organization and brought forth the Pennsylvania regulations that are now part of Chapter 78 and 78A, and those were evaluated. And I would recommend that you read that report, and that may answer some of your questions.
Yeah, Chapter 78 very detailed describes Pennsylvania's regulations as compared to other states.
And that's Stronger, just like it's spelled.
May I add something else, too, to that, Jim?
Yes.
There's also a difference, and it was pointed out in the presentation, these different setbacks among the states, a difference in terms of where the measurement is from. And measuring from the borehole is different than measuring from the disturbed area.
Right.
Particularly as it would address maybe the idling activity versus the drilling activity. So I think that's something that should be also pointed out, that it's apples and oranges in terms of where you measure from, and it establishes a setback.
Bill Pulisic, Camera Holla. You are probably aware that multiple volatile organic compound air pollution studies have been published that report findings that are contrary to your central premise regarding setbacks. Again, if your report was an attempt to be a thorough review of the subject, why would you not use data from the 3 Pennsylvania DEP studies on Marcellus regions in the state, the study by the Eastern Research Group and Sage Environmental Consulting on air quality in Fort Worth, or the GETS study of Marcellus wells, all of which found very little of concern regarding volatile organic compounds from drilling locations?
All right, let me see if I can address some of that, because it's a little bit of a complex answer. Yeah, part of the problem is what I said when I started. None of the studies I did it. My study was for the West Virginia DEP, so we looked at what the Pennsylvania DEP was doing, talked to some of the Pennsylvania DEP, found out, and there are things that we just, none of us had the money and the time to do. We were asked, get this done, get it done for this price, and get it done quickly, okay? So if you were asking me what I would have done, I would have liked to have sat at a lot of these wells for a very long period of time. We're just beginning to do that now. So we have something called MSEAL, the Marcellus Shale Engineering and Environmental Laboratory at WVU. It's a well, an actual well that's that's been dug and gone into production, and we monitored it for the entire time it was in. We need to do that probably a couple of hundred more times, because what I mentioned was part of what the difficulty is what's the terrain you were in, okay? So we would have to classify different kinds of terrain. So we'll have to do 100 wells that are sitting down in real narrow valleys. We'll have to do 100 wells that are sitting in slightly wider valleys. We'll have to do 100 wells that are sitting up on top of a hill. We'll have to do wells that are in narrow valleys under conditions where you've got inversions, and in slightly wider, you can see how it's coming on. And so, in fact, none of our studies so far are really very thorough in terms of what they're producing. So I can say, to the best of my ability and knowledge at this point, as I said to start with, we didn't see anything above the NAAQS. We did see some volatile organic compounds that were higher and that were measurable, and in fact the DEP studies in Pennsylvania found some of those things. National Ambient Air Quality Standards. No, we were not finding anything above the NAAQS for the 6 pollutants that were there. Well, 5 pollutants that were there. We didn't look for lead. So we didn't find anything, and it says that right in the report, and that's why I wanted to mention that up front when I started talking, right? But we haven't done enough variability in enough locations over enough time to tell you what the real story is. We can tell you, this is what we did, this is what we found when we did it. So anybody that says they know without a doubt what the levels are, they're not telling you the truth. And I'd be lying to you if I said, here's the absolute level that you're going to get. You're safe, you're not safe, whatever. I don't have the data yet to do that. Okay? And nor does the Pennsylvania DEP, nor does anybody else who's published in this field. That's just where the science is right now. As a scientist, I feel like I should be apologizing to you because, if you're expecting us to be protecting you, we haven't gotten there yet. It's slow, and it's painfully slow sometimes where we have to do this. But we're proceeding apace as best we can. And so we will tell you what we found when we found it. And if it reassures you, good. It should reassure you. If it doesn't reassure you, good. Maybe it shouldn't reassure you. And it's because we really are, as Dr. Haley keeps saying, we really are at the early stages in all of this. If you see these, the CSI shows on TV where they show you, oh yeah, we'll get an answer overnight on this thing, or in 20 seconds. Yeah, anybody who's ever been in the laboratory will tell you that never happens. That's television. Everybody goes home happy. Everybody's, the hero saves the day. Doesn't happen like that in real life. Sorry. But what we're trying to do in these situations is say, here's what we know. And if we see something, like those benzene levels that I saw, those are not good benzene levels. I can tell you, those weren't good benzene levels. They were 80 parts per billion. 80 parts per billion, we should be putting workers in respirators for that. That's not a good thing. But does that happen all the time? No. Did it happen here? Yes. Did we see more benzene in other places? Yes. And was it above the standard for chronic exposures? Yes. What is that going to mean? Well, I can't tell you how often that's going to happen. I can't tell you whether or not that's going to happen a lot to you. And that's my attempt at telling you the best truth I can tell you. It's complicated, and you'll all fall asleep by the time I'm through uncomplicating just one of the knots, of the many knots that are there.
Thank you. Jim,
and that's what we're doing.
question.
Yep. Dr. McCawley, what procedure would you recommend to determine and achieve safe setbacks?
Yeah. The setbacks, I said in the paper, I said up here sort of, and didn't say it very loudly, but I will tell you, I don't believe in setbacks at all. Because we've got the meteorology, we've got the topography, places change, processes change, things change. And so from a health standpoint, not from a safety standpoint, from a safety standpoint, there's some pretty good information. But even that is, if you've got a hill in the way, well, you can be closer. But if you don't have a hill in the way, you may want to be a little farther away if something blows up. But from dilution standpoints of will this stuff dilute? Yeah, in some cases it'll dilute, in other cases it won't dilute, and it depends on the weather. You tell me what the weather is going to be doing on the day they drill right now, and I'll tell you whether the setback's any good. Unfortunately, you're not going to be able to tell me what the weather's doing. That's why I don't really care for setbacks. I think, monitor, find out what's going on, make sure that you've got quality in your process. If you got quality in your process, then you're being kept as safe as somebody can keep you. Right? And is that going to be safe enough? We don't know the answer to that yet.
Darren Polisic, 6153 Camera Holler Road. Regarding benzene, isn't it true that studies cited in your report did not separate out the incremental air quality impacts from natural gas development-related activities from other background sources of air pollution that are around us every day? Specifically, isn't it true that the Macy study that you cited did not include the collection of control samples, such as upwind air samples or wind direction data that would be needed to identify oil and gas-related activity as likely sources of measured emissions?
We did collect background samples for some of the locations. So, yes, there are background samples. And I can tell you that when we were at one location, it was nothing but background samples because they weren't doing any drilling. So on one of the vertical drilling sites, they weren't doing any vertical drilling. That was background. And we still saw benzene, and that was what led me to believe that actually what we were seeing was the truck traffic. Because I know from doing a lot of diesel sampling that you're going to see benzene if you got diesel trucks. And is that background or is that part of the process? You're going to have to tell me. It depends upon whether you consider it part of the process, all of the truck traffic. Is that part of the process or is that just something else that's going on? Well, the truck traffic wouldn't be there if they weren't drilling. So I tend to lump it in with that. But, we saw, parts 4 parts per billion of benzene when there was just truck traffic going on. So there's that. When we got away from where they were doing any of this drilling and took background samples, we weren't seeing any benzene at all. I took some samples in some other areas around Morgantown, for example, away from the traffic, the downtown truck traffic. If I sampled where I showed you those data for the particulate levels, I'd find benzene there because I know there's diesel trucks there. And we find a background. And for when we're doing the MSEAL sampling right now, as we're doing the Marcellus Shale Engineering Laboratory, we see background levels of all sorts of things when they're not drilling. And so, yes, there is background to this. Now, is that good or bad? Well, if you're being constantly exposed to something, then whatever the drilling is doing is adding incrementally to that. I'm not sure that's good news. But, yes, there's something else there. It's something that's part of the background. And we tried to sort of separate that out, but we were asked specifically by the DEP, and we had strictures put on us as to what we could do and how we could do it. Okay? So we had to sample at this one location for this one selected period of time. And that's what we saw when we were there when that was going on. And the organics are touchy to sample.
Also, the study by Dr. McKenzie that we detailed in the paper did have background measurements that compared to the gas well sites.
Dr. Haley, as a radiation oncologist, please comment on potential risk associated with drilling waste and flowback with regard to radiation exposure.
So that's a whole different topic, and again, that's an area of burgeoning science. There are widely divergent opinions on this in science, and there's not a lot of good publication on it. The Pennsylvania DEP did do a T-norm study, which stands for technologically enhanced naturally occurring radioactive material, specifically looking at drill sites, and they came to the conclusion that there was unlikely to be any significant effect on workers or the public, and did not recommend any special monitoring. On the other hand, we know that before the DEP clamped down on waste disposal, we were seeing some radioactive waste popping up in impoundment ponds and being disposed of into natural waterways. So I think that the T-norm situation has improved over the past 5 years. Of course, when we were still seeing the waste disposal that was not well regulated in the early days of fracking in Pennsylvania, the concern is, could there be any long-term effects from that? And again, the latency period has not reached the point that we're seeing anything from that. So it's an area I'm definitely interested in, but the data is really divergent, and it's an area that we're just beginning to look at.
Bruce Livengood, 6202 Bollinger Road. To directly quote your paper, you say that hydraulic fracturing is a relatively recent well stimulation technique. Considering that 1953 was the date the first well in Pennsylvania was hydraulic fractured, and since it is in excess of 1.1 million wells have been fractured in the U.S. alone, how can you consider your statement accurate?
So I should qualify that as being directional hydraulic fracturing. The traditional hydraulic fracturing that was done 50 years ago was, as you know, a vertical conventional well. You still had the technique of fracturing the shale and pulling the gas out, but you did not have the horizontal drilling that you have now. So it's similar, but again, as I said in the beginning of my talk, it's the quantity and scope of the process is much, much larger, and so the effects that we're seeing from it are more magnified.
Barbara Sims, 3837 Hills Church. For Dr. Haley, in your comments at Peters Township, you stated that Marcellus gas drilling's debate boils down to politics, money, and science. Is there a way to resolve the quandary, and is the science stepping up fast enough to protect our health?
Those are all really good questions. So yes, definitely. And when we looked specifically at the issue of setbacks, we found that it was a compromise between legislatures, environmental groups, and landowners. That's basically what a setback was. There was no science behind it, which is why it intrigued me to study it. Again, each community has to make that decision, unfortunately. We have the 500-foot minimum setback for Pennsylvania. And again, if we look at the different states, you have the very conservative to the very liberal as far as setback distances. So, the science, as Dr. McCawley said, is still it's still being developed, and I wish we could tell you exactly what a safe setback distance is, but we're not at that point yet, unfortunately.
Wow, this is for you, Alan Cohen.
Uh-oh.
Michelle Clark, 5180 Maymont Road. Monitoring, who pays for it legally? Driller, taxes, landowner, insurance. What is the recommended response to high counts of monitoring, reporting expected response, etc.? Who pays for the monitoring if it was implemented in the ordinance, I think was the first question.
It would be under the scenario of engineering and site issues being a responsibility of an applicant. It would be the applicant. Under a conditional use, that could be a reasonable condition. I'm not going to defend it here in court, but that could be a reasonable condition, construed as a reasonable condition.
Eleanor Sharp, 3339 Shady Drive. Doctors McCawley and Haley, in addition to your own recent research paper, which studies would you recommend for helping the public to fairly evaluate the health and safety risk associated with unconventional gas development?
So when the public asks me this question, I usually direct them to a group called PSE. It's PSE Health Energy, and they have a very comprehensive library of studies on this subject, and they also produce their own research, and it's a pretty good scientific panel and a lot of consultant experts in the field. So I think for a general resource, I think that's an excellent place to start.
Golly. Yeah, there are a number of citizens groups. If you're worried about your community, there are a number of citizens groups that have been worried about their communities, and you can find them on the web pretty easily. I worked with the Breathe Easy Susquehanna County folks, and they were trying to pull together a lot of information. Rebecca Roeder is the person up there in Susquehanna County up in Gasland. If there are a number of industry groups that the Marcellus Shale organization, which is in the Pennsylvania area, collects a lot of the industry information. So if you want to know what the industry thinks, you can go to that. There's also environmentally friendly drilling in Houston, Texas, EFD. And they sponsor research on how to do the best job on that. Now, I will, so that you know, I have in fact been funded in the past by the environmentally friendly drilling operation, and they are a collaboration of both government, industry, and environmental groups. So they're also a good resource for this kind of stuff, and it will give you, I think, more of the industry side than the community advocacy side. So I think it's important to know what both sides are saying.
Your paper makes specific reference to community-based Susquehanna County study that found 25% of grab samples collected by volunteers and not scientists or even technicians contain benzene levels above the 1 per 100,000 EPA cancer risk level. Isn't it misleading to make that statement without revealing the fact that the actual number of samples collected is only 4 total, meaning that only 1 was found at that level? Surely you do not believe or contend that the grab samples by lay volunteers are representative of chronic air exposure levels that are also comparable with EPA cancer risk calculations based upon years of exposure. If your report was an attempt to be a thorough review of the subject, why didn't you include data from the 2014 study by Bunch in the Barnett Shale that relied on millions of more representative 1-hour and 24-hour measurements of benzene rather than just 4 grab samples collected in Susquehanna County? Paulberg, 2801 Pleasant Valley Road.
So those are good questions. So as far as the Bunch study, I believe we did reference that in our paper as one that did do a lot of air monitoring samples and did not find any that were over the limit of health concern. And, you know, it was impossible for this paper to put in every air pollution study. You know, there are just too many of them coming out, and particularly in the past several years, which we pointed out in our limitations. And yes, the study by the grab sample study has been criticized because of the methodology, which, you know, is why we did not rely totally on that study for our paper. We included it, but we also put in other studies with more rigorous methodology in our paper. So again, you know, this was a review. We focused on benzene and the sulfides, and you know, we were looking at multiple different parameters in this paper, and it just was not practical to, you know, try to include every single air pollution study. I don't know if you want to comment on that. Yeah.
Kathleen Boris, 6371 Kemmer Holler. This question may be better directed elsewhere, but I am wondering if any studies have been conducted relative to hydraulic fracturing in previously coal-mined areas. What setbacks might you suggest, given the knowledge that is out there or not there, such as the case may be?
I'm not sure about the coal mines, but I know that the Chapter 78 has now put in a lot of regulation regarding orphan wells and setbacks from orphan wells, so they're really looking at that. Are you aware of any coal mine regulation for setbacks?
No, I don't know of any regulations for that. I know that the industry will utter a number of expletives when they run into one of these mines, because it really mucks with their sampling. I mean, with their drilling. And the one thing that I know everybody worries about, the communities and the industry both, is getting a crosstalk between an old well and the well that they're drilling, because sometimes that happens where the Marcellus is under such high pressure. Somebody was asking about, well, hasn't this been going on since the 1950s? Yeah, and Dr. Haley's comment was, you know, it's so much, this is so much bigger. This is a monster truck versus a toy truck kind of situation where the pressures and the gas flows that we're getting from these Marcellus shale wells are so much bigger than anything that we've gotten before, which is good news and bad news, right? That things happen now that never happened before. And I've heard from residents that said, well, we had an old gas well on our property, they were drilling down, and suddenly they blew the old fittings off of the well, and we had all sorts of things going on, and stuff came into the house, and it blew out all of the gas appliances, and we were getting all of this oil mist that was coming in. Yeah, it happens. And that's one of the worries. And I know that in a couple of places, people have been talking about getting releases of volatile organics in their area, and they can't tell where it's coming from. And the suspicion is a lot of this is coming because they've somehow or other upset some of these old coal mines that had gas seams running around them or through them, and gotten releases coming up out of the ground from that. Got a call from somebody the other day who said they're getting gas releases up through the ground around their house and had to evacuate their house. What was it coming from? And we had to tell them, we have no idea. Could be anything. And it's just the geology of the situation. So when you get into these areas like Pennsylvania and West Virginia where there are these old coal mines, things happen. Stuff happens. And so, you know, if you have one of those around you and they happen to drill into it, everybody's got a problem. And I think everybody tries to do their best to avoid that because it's not good for anybody. But it can happen. And when it does, it can cause all sorts of things, and we can't predict all of the things that it's going to cause. You know, you're going to get gas escaping from all sorts of different places. Yeah, it's going to upset the drilling process. It's going to be a mess.
Allison Holt, 4830 Primrose Lane. Does the data indicate that various phases of the operations under normal circumstances have different levels of associated risk for air pollution? For example, site preparation, drilling, fracking, well completion, flaring. Which are the most associated with public health risks?
Well, the one that everybody's associated is the actual hydraulic fracturing. Part of the reason for that is that when you're doing the hydraulic frac, and the industry doesn't like the word frac, but when you're doing, frac is the term everybody knows and uses, right? When you're doing that fracturing, you bring all of these very large diesel engines on site, and you run them full bore. These are off-road diesel engines, the size of locomotives. And so you're getting a lot of stuff coming off of that. You're getting sand that's going down the hole, so you're creating a lot of dust. Now, a lot of these problems are being worked on, okay? So the more I've seen over the last 5 years, the lower I've seen the levels getting. So there's some hope there to that. But it's probably the hydraulic fracturing that is the one. And if you're going to have flaring, we're trying to get away from flaring. The industry's trying to get away from flaring. Nobody likes flaring. And there are ways to do that. And so flaring would be bad. The hydraulic fracturing would be something. The other interesting thing, I think, is the pad prep, because they bring in a lot of earth-moving equipment, and so it's like doing major construction in an area. And major construction is just dirty. So they're moving a lot of dirt. They're aerosolizing. They're making a lot of dust, airborne. And so that tends to get things dirty. And the other thing that people really complain about is truck traffic. not only because there's diesel exhaust, but as the trucks run up and down these roads, if you got 10,000 truckloads going up and down the road, you decimate that road really, really fast. And you will see around a lot of the sites, as I have, people going, please slow down, there's too much dust, because the trucks will be rambling over these partially demolished roads and really creating a lot of dust. And so that's a process that people don't normally think about with the rest of what's going on with the drilling operation on the pad, is just the trucks rumbling in and out of the pad area around roads that kind of get demolished. In the meantime, they repair them eventually. But while they're demolished and while they're ground into dust, they're creating a lot of problems for a lot of people.
The last question for this evening. When doing, this is Ron Slabe, Upper Borough, PA. When doing your research on setbacks, did you account for the following studies concerning closeness to fracking sites and increased health concerns? John Hopkins study of premature births, University of Pennsylvania, Columbia University studies, Colorado School of Public Health, Brown University and Birth Defects, University of Pittsburgh Heart and Respiratory, and Albany State University Cancer.
Some of that was timing. Some of those were just coming out when we were writing the paper. Please remember that the peer review process takes probably about a year. So some of these came out after I wrote the paper. So at the time, I included the ones that I felt were pertinent health effect papers that had come out and had been peer reviewed. And the editors of the journal did not want me to focus a lot on the papers with health effects. They wanted me to more narrow the focus on the setbacks and the particular parameters that we were examining in the paper. They felt that to focus too much on health effects would not be totally germane to the focus of the paper. So we did not include every single one that we could have, but again, some of it was a timing issue.
Do the members of council have any questions for our speakers?
I have to always talk.
Of course you do, Dave.
Just one general comment. There's a lot of discussion tonight about toxicological studies. I think the speakers, they've presented a lot of uncertainty associated with the existing studies. That's very typical within this type of process. Tox studies, you're trying to interpret humans, not the lab rats. That it's really easy to look at lab rats, you dose them, you look for a response. Humans, we drink too much alcohol, we smoke, we do things we shouldn't. Those are confounding interferences that really make tox studies difficult to interpret. The other big issue you have is the latency period for a lot of the constituents that we're looking at are 20, 30 years. Benzene's a Class A carcinogen. It's got a latency period. You get exposed to it. Its latency period is about 20 years before you're going to get lung cancer above a certain level. But it takes you 15, 20, 25 years for that to happen. So the uncertainty that is being expressed by the two speakers tonight is very typical in this talks process. And EPA, DEP, they have put a lot of, in things like benzene and a lot of other constituents, they've put a lot of factors in there to account for the unknowns associated with some of the exposures that people have to different chemicals. The other problem that you also run into was that it was mentioned you end up with these things known as synergistic effects. I may be exposed to benzene, but it concurrently, let me give a better example, asbestos. If I'm exposed to just asbestos, it's really not that bad. There's a form known as chrysotile. This room would be really dusty, and I'd have to be exposed to chrysotile asbestos for quite a long time before I get some form of lung cancer or mesothelioma, whatever it is. As soon as I throw cigarette smoking into it, bam, it goes up. It's like a 10x factor. It's a much more synergistic effect, much more dangerous for people. So the point where I'm trying to drill down to is you can always find problems with studies. But scientists, by nature of trying to look at specific chemicals, have to be protective because it's impossible to account what these things will do to you because of the latency period. So I know a lot of people were shaking their heads when they were talking about some of the uncertainty factors, and I'm like, yeah, it happens, because it's going to be 15, 20 years before everybody knows, is it safe, is it not safe? A lot of the stuff that's out there right now shows it is, but a lot of the new science is starting to show it isn't. That's the problem with some of the presentation, is there's no way to say with certainty what you have. So it's a tough one. I'm glad I'm not trying to answer what you guys are doing, because it's difficult, because every study is, especially tox studies, they're really difficult to try, and make perfect. You can't, as a matter of fact. So.
Which is why they keep studying.
They have to.
Gentleman over here that has a...
No, with Dave,
Oh.
along that line.
Your name and address, please.
Ed Valentis, Huntley. Monroeville. No, I'm good. I'm pretty loud. When you build a plant...
You have to, so
Yes.
people at home can hear
Yeah,
you.
on TV, yeah.
I can hear you, they can't. I get yelled at all the time because people can't hear me.
And you guys can probably help more on this, too. When you build a plant or an old steel mill and you have those particulates every single day and it's a cumulative basis, or we go in a coal mine and you work 30 years and retire and all these things take effect, is it still the same concern that something's going to be out there for 2 weeks or 3 weeks to frack a well and then it's gone and it's put back to the farm and there actually crops build up to that thing? The cumulative effect, I understand, of those industries, horrific. But is a 2 or 3 or 4 week process and then gone in the same realm? Just a question.
Are they hypersensitive?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. Maybe.
Let me-
Maybe. You don't know, because hypersensitive individuals, you run into that all the time.
Let me point out what I did, because I was consulted by the state of Maryland for their study, their risk assessment study. And one of the things I pointed out to them, and it kind of made it into their risk assessment, was that if you think of the well pad as just a single well pad, it's there, it's gone, there's never anything else, then you probably don't have as much to worry about. But in the drilling industry, you've got this well pad here, and then just down the road you got the next drill pad, just down the road you got the next drill pad. We're talking about thousands of these. And so you have to worry about what the cumulative effect of all of the industry is, and how long does it stay in an area. According to theory, there's no problem with smog in Los Angeles. It doesn't happen. According to theory. Because 300 meters back from the road, it disappears. Well, yeah, that's true under certain situations, but if you've got an inversion, if you've got the right meteorological conditions, if you've got the right topography, stuff sticks around. I was out in the middle of nowhere, West Virginia, which is real easy to find. You just go down the road for a little while. Yeah. And I found levels that were like downtown Los Angeles, that were coming from somewhere. In fact, I did my master's thesis on ozone exposures. And ozone, you have to have a lot of traffic to produce ozone, particularly at the levels I was seeing of 100 parts per billion. But I was seeing them in Mount Storm, West Virginia, where a traffic jam is both cars coming to the stoplight at the same time, right? And and you need sunlight to produce ozone, right? And I was seeing these high ozone levels at 12 o'clock, midnight, when even in Mount Storm there's not sunlight, So what was happening is the weather was bringing it in from somewhere else. And so now you have to worry about what's coming from where and what's going on where. So yes, you should be concerned about what happens in your community, but you may want to be concerned about what happens in Peters Township. You may want to be concerned about what happens over in Wheeling, yeah. And so you just, it's not, there's again, not a simple answer.
Okay. Yes, Alan.
Question. We're tackling municipalities across the state legislature, DEP, regulations, trying to find the right answer, the right number, the magic wand of this will make it okay, protect public health and safety. Yet, it appears from the information we've received over our last two programs and tonight, it's evolving. The answers are somewhat subjective to the point of what information you received yesterday, to some degree. How do we as public officials and public policy managers deal with that evolution of information, particularly that, as you say, these are preliminary studies. These are studies that may need more information. And how does that how does what you've produced specifically interface with public policy decisions?
So a good step is what you're doing. You know, you brought in the officials from the DEP to speak to the community and the board, and you brought in members from industry also, and then you brought in scientists. So I think that's a good start. What you're doing is a good thing. Like Mr. Perry said, I don't envy you. You don't envy us, but I don't envy you. That it's really, these are very tough decisions because, again, we can't say this is absolutely what you should do. You know, each community is trying to decide what's best for their particular community, and it's a really tough thing.
I mean, I recall studying and observing as a young person the Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act and what the standards were and how the debate was. And again, a lot of it was politics, compromise. Yeah. Are the numbers, the ambient standards, the numbers? No one can say yes or no. They're just there in many ways. Would that be an accurate statement?
Yeah, that would be entirely accurate. I mean, anything that's a law is a political process. Scientists tend not to make laws, which is good for all of us. Lawmakers want the scientists to draw a clear, bright line that they can say, on this side we're good, on that side we're bad, and any scientist worth his salt is going to run in the opposite direction from that question. Because they're, in science, you know, the best we get is a kind of grayish, fuzzy line. Mm-hmm. And even then, we're uncomfortable with that.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you both for coming tonight. I think you have given a lot of information to people who listened carefully. They may not understand all of it, but it will be on the on Channel 19 rerun. How soon, Mike?
Well, probably tomorrow.
Okay, so you can sit there and digest it and redigest it and redigest it, and if you have questions, you have been given some information on websites that you can turn to try to find more answers. Dr. McCawley and Dr. Haley, we appreciate very much the time you have taken tonight to come and talk to us. We have a process we've been working through for a heck of a long time. And, you know, I've often said the world isn't black and white. The world is the gray area, and we keep trying to slog through the gray area, trying to find a compromise between what this side wants and what that side wants, and what is best for the community, which is somewhere in that gray area in the middle. So with the information you've provided, as well as the information from Huntley & Huntley and the information from DEP, and the research that Alan will continue to do, and that Jim will continue to do, and the resources that we will continue to tap, one of these days we will find a document that we can all live with. Thank you again. Thank you, residents, for listening, for being respectful of our speakers. And next week we'll discuss where we go from here.